Okay, I think we will get started. It looks like we have a few people who have joined in the last minute or so. So welcome everyone to today's presentation on the data privacy landscape for travel marketers. This is the first of 3 webinars designed for digital marketers who work in the travel sector. We created this series of webinars by asking our customers in the travel sector one very simple question, which is, what's keeping you awake at night? And there'll be no surprises that we got 3 answers on repeat. The first one is data privacy, so that's what we're talking about here today. The second topic was cookie deprecation, and we've got a webinar planned for cookie deprecation on the 10th of April. That's going to be covered by our head of digital analytics, who's joining us here today, Benoit Weber, and our digital director, who is Selena Goff. And then the third topic, which is a very popular topic, was generative AI in marketing. So we're covering that on the 24th of April, and that's going to be hosted by our Chief Innovation Officer, Freddie. So how today's going to work is that we have gathered a load of questions from our clients and contacts in the travel industry. And we've grouped them into these presentations, and then we've organized the presentation around the questions that they were asking, and we're responding to each one of those questions. So let's get started. The webinar objectives. So by the end of this webinar, you are going to be able to cover 4 topics. So the evolving data privacy landscape, and that's going to be talking about the aspects of data privacy that are driven by regulation, and then some of the aspects that are being driven by the platforms themselves. How to comply with regulation in Australia and globally. And we're going to provide an overview of how these changes will affect marketing measurement. And then we're also going to dip into technologies travel brands are using to enhance privacy. In terms of your presenters, there's a number of us presenting today, so we'll do a quick introduction. First up, I just want to give a thank you to Andre, who's behind the scenes. You can't see him, but he's there pushing buttons in the background to make this work, so thank you, Andre. I'm the host and presenter for today, so my name's Paul Hewett. I'm the CEO of In Marketing We Trust. I oversee the agency to ensure that we're providing the right services to our clients in the travel industry, and I also do some consulting and collaboration with some of our clients. As you can probably tell, I'm not from Australia. I do live in Australia. I've been here for about 8 years, but I'm originally from Wales in the UK. And my work has mostly taken me across the UK, Europe, North America, and so on. And I'm doing a lot of work, obviously, here in APAC as well. My experience is that I have 20 years in digital and direct marketing. So my expertise is across strategy, marketing, technology and automation, data analysis, and direct response. Cover a lot of bases there, but you can fit a lot in 2 decades. And prior to joining In Marketing We Trust, I owned a company called RMG Response, and that was one of the largest direct response agencies for travel brands in the UK. My experience in the travel sector specifically, my first clients that I ever worked with were travel brands. So back in Wales, I worked with Visit Wales and almost all of the destination marketing organizations in Wales, around 22 of them. And I currently work with a range of businesses globally in the travel sector, so OTAs, tour operators, and destinations. My travel brag is that despite being severely frightened of flying, I really, really hate it. I've traveled around the world 16 times in the past decade, mostly for work, visiting around 21 countries and 104 cities. So that's me. I'm going to hand over to Ben.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ben. I'm the head of analytics at In Marketing We Trust. I'm actually French, but I'm based in Vietnam, so in the north of Vietnam, close to China. I've been working in analytics for the last almost 10 years now, working especially around governance, dashboarding, reporting, data collection, conversion optimization, data warehouse, and privacy. My travel brag is I didn't do 16 times the around the world, but I've seen quite a few countries, and my brag is that I lost count, so I'm not even counting anymore. And then I worked in different countries, so in Spain, Poland, Switzerland, Vietnam, and France, which helped me having a different aspect of cultures also. And then I worked in different with different brands, and I just put a few here, but Alitalia, Johnny Beyond, and Wild Shea are some of the travel brands I've been working with. And then over to you, Marco.
Thank you, Ben. Just let the slide swap over. I guess I can get started. So my name's Marco. I'm an account manager here at In Marketing We Trust. My role is centered around building not just relationships, but partnerships with our clients from a diverse range of industries, and also travel of being one of them. So my family is Serbian, and I grew up in New Zealand and recently moved over to the Gold Coast, where I'm based. My travel brag is kind of in between Paul's and Ben's. While I haven't lost track yet and something I'd like to do, I have been to 28 countries, and a big achievement for me was organizing a 4-month OE for 10 people, which is a very scary thing to do and challenging, but nonetheless very rewarding. My travel experience and focus of my career over the past few years has been really around analytics, but also focusing on performance, media, and SEO, and working with a variety of destinations, cruise, and tour operators. Some of the key brands that I work with currently are Globus family of brands, as well as Destination Gold Coast.
Perfect. Thank you both. So to kick things off, I just want to take you through why we've got the authority to speak to travel marketers about their own industry. So In Marketing We Trust was built for travel brands. So our Chief Innovation Officer, Freddie, worked for travel brands prior to starting In Marketing We Trust, and Expedia was one of our founding clients. And that was about a decade ago, and we're still working with them. We currently work with travel brands all over the world, and the reason they tell us they choose to work with us is because of 3 competitive advantages that we have and that we provide to them. The first is we're a leading digital agency with digital expertise. The next is unparalleled travel and tourism experience. And the third is localized language and culture capability. So I'll just take you through each one of those very briefly, just to prove out the points so they're not big claims without any backing. So the first being a leading digital expert. We are a data-driven agency first, and that's what we focus on. It's really important that we're at the cutting edge of data-driven digital, and that's something that we try to do on a global level. Our work with some of the largest websites in the world has equipped us with sophisticated tools and expertise. And we've managed to build proprietary tools and IP out of that. So our crawler, which is something that we've built, has crawled over 200 million URLs. And for one client, we've collected around 20 billion rows of data. And that's enabled us to optimize conversions and generate millions or tens of millions in additional revenue for that particular client. And for another client, we have optimized around 50 million URLs. And again, that's using our proprietary platform called ScalePath. That was voted one of the most innovative marketing technologies of 2023 by AFR, something that we're really proud of. And then last year, the big number you can see on the screen there, 17,000 pieces of content. That was 17,000 pieces of accurate, brand safe, search engine safe travel content. And again, that was built with a proprietary AI platform that's built on top of large language models that you may have heard of. And it safeguards commercial data. So we're going to deep dive into that topic a bit more at one of our future webinars. The second claim is unparalleled travel and tourism experience. We've worked with 37 travel brands across 4 continents. And they range from OTAs. We've worked with a lot of OTAs in our time, tour operators, cruise companies, airlines, and travel insurance brands. So really good experience in the travel industry. And then the last item is localized language and culture capability. As of today, we've got around 54 team members, and they're based in strategic locations around the world that enable us to deliver global services for our clients. And those 54 team members speak a combination of 18 languages, and importantly, they understand local culture. And they have active campaigns in 30 countries at the moment. And one for anyone who's joined us who may be interested in joining our team in the future. We do our Trusted Conference every year in a different country, and we've now done 7 countries, including Sydney, Vietnam, Cambodia. We went to Borneo one year. So we really live and breathe travel as a team. So that's us and why we think we've got the authority to speak on this topic. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to start by setting the scene. So why are we even talking about data privacy? Then we're going to hop across to navigating global and Australian data privacy. And then we will jump to measuring marketing performance in a world of disappearing data. And then finally, we will look at using technology to enhance privacy. The main content is going to take us about an hour from this point. And if you do have questions, you'll see in your controls there is a Q&A section. Put your questions in there and we will answer them when we get to the end. Okay, so we're not going to disrupt the flow because we've got a lot of good content to cover and only an hour or so to get through that. So before we get started, our lawyers wanted you to read this disclaimer, so I'll leave it up for a moment. But essentially it states that we are marketers. So we're not qualified to provide compliance advice that will stand up in any court of law in Australia or anywhere else in the world. Our lawyers, on the other hand, are qualified and they can provide compliance advice that will stand up in a court of law. But it is important to notice everything that we're going to communicate here today, we use in our business on a regular basis, and it's been built through experience. We're delivering projects for clients all over the world across data infrastructure and analytics. So it's good content that's being used in practice. If you are going to do anything, you must seek legal advice on this topic before taking any specific action for your brand. Okay, so that's the disclaimer. I'll assume you've read it and I will move on. So the first topic we're going to get to is the current marketing landscape and what is changing. As I've mentioned, I gathered questions from our customers and contacts. So what I'll do is I will read those questions out loud, and I will then allow a team member to respond to them. So the first question you asked us was, what key shifts in the data privacy landscape are currently influencing digital marketing strategies, especially for those in the travel industry? And for this question, I'm going to hand things over to Marco.
Thank you very much, Paul. So firstly, to set the scene around privacy and how it sort of evolved and the main drivers of it, privacy has been quite a hot topic and industry trend from just before the time of COVID, and has rapidly evolved and become very integral to marketers in terms of the impact on us and the repercussions there. Some of the key things that play a part in this is increased privacy regulations, which before didn't fully exist or fully fleshed out, have recently become quite robust and are constantly been adjusted. So things like the GDPR has been very much the sort of backbone of that. Another key thing is the loss of third-party cookies. This is something we will jump into deeper in another webinar, so stay tuned for that one. But essentially that is really impacting advertisers' ability to track conversions and engage users. Shortened conversion windows, so tighter timeframes for holding cookies that we might have, as little as 24 hours in some cases. Limitations in app tracking. So for example, iOS 14's release eliminated non-consensual sharing of identifiers for advertisers. And then finally, the rise of ad blockers, which is more significant than initially anticipated, to the degree that over 26% of US internet users currently use them. And this surges when we look at younger demographics, so those aged 15 to 33, up to 45%. And they don't only block ad display, but they can also disrupt conversion tracking through JavaScript blocking. Next slide, please. So what does this mean? Ultimately, it means we have less data, but the question is, what's driving then? How much data do we actually have? So through all of these, there are some key ones that really come into effect more so than others. So this is largely driven by data privacy by regulation. So again, as I mentioned, the EU being sort of the front runner here in terms of what privacy reform looks like and enforcement, and then that having a sort of knock-on effect to other districts and their regulation. So in the US, the California Privacy Rights Act, for example, being very strong and prominent. And then similarly here in Australia, while it's not as robust, there are coming reforms to the Privacy Act, for example, this year that will change how marketers can target users and what data we can collect and what that looks like. And this again extends to platforms and search engines through their competition, not only to adhere to these privacy regulations, but also in competition to offer the best experience and be trusted by users. So a very prominent example of this is with Safari, with the release of Intelligent Tracking Protocol, or ITP. When this was released, it prevented cross-site tracking and by restricting the use of third-party cookies for users. There were other elements of this as well. So for example, cookie storage limits were decreased. And this was significant impact for marketers at the time, and still continues to this day with privacy, with Safari now creating private browsing in 2023 is the sort of latest effort that prioritizes privacy. And this extends to other platforms as well. So iOS, as I mentioned before, but also Firefox and Chrome, while it's late to the game, it has, as of this year, turned off cookies for 1% of their users. And that amounts to approximately 30 million. And the outcome of this is, from our perspective, is we've generally observed 10 to 20% of people refusing to be tracked. And that can be as high as 40% for users in Germany, for example. So again, that highlights that culture plays a very important role here. Next slide, please. And now when we're looking at impacts, there's two sort of stages to this. There's for general marketing in general, but then also more specifically to travel marketers. So firstly, the three big ones that come to mind start with trust. So users are more informed than ever around data collection and usage, and brands who don't prioritize building trust risk significant impacts to their brand sentiment, reputation, and consumer engagement. And trust was something also found by Boston Consulting Group when they did a lot of analysis here to correspond with and indicate higher digital maturity. The next one here is a bit more tangible for marketers, which is measurement gaps. So regulation and user opt-out limits the attribution and insights we have for marketing activity, making it more difficult to track users across touch points and understand them. And then the last one is decreased ROAS. Now, while that says decreased ROAS, it is more perceived, but there is an actual decrease as well. But that largely comes from constraints on the abilities to explicitly target audiences, and further from data collection from the measurement gaps mentioned previously. Now, when we're looking for travel marketers specifically, two things come to mind as key impacts. One is that for travel marketers more so than domestic businesses, they have cross-border operations. So a global customer base means that they need to collect, process, and store personal data from individuals residing in multiple different regions. This is then complicated due to some regions restricting the transfer of personal data across borders. So for example, GDPR doesn't allow data from EU users to be transferred to other countries without those countries having met set levels of privacy regulation themselves. So this requires marketers to adhere to data privacy regulation in every market which they operate and every market where their users are. And these considerations do extend to the platforms themselves, like Google Ads and Meta, who implement their own changes and restrictions within the platforms to adhere to those regulations. The second point here is the complexity of the customer journey for travel consumers. They spend weeks or even months researching destinations, and often across multiple platforms and devices, such as smartphones, tablets, laptops, and so on, reading reviews, looking at ratings, and a lot of other things before making a booking. And travelers must also account for seasonality, trends, and external factors, not just in their destination that they're planning to go to, but also within their own country of residence. And what this means ultimately is that with the restrictions in access to timely and granular data, it can often hinder travel marketers' ability to identify and respond in real time to the changing trends and market dynamics. The reliance on cross-device tracking, again, impacting their ability to understand consumer behavior. And what does this look like now in terms of what's happening in the industry? So consent mode V2 is a good way to sort of highlight this. So in March, Google released consent mode V2, which is a more advanced mode of their consent mode. And this was designed to adhere to new privacy regulation. Essentially, it tells Google what consent a website user is given for cookies, and it only takes into effect when a user refuses cookies, giving you some insights as opposed to none. If you don't have it, and you have users within regions where there are regulations, for example, EU and California, you won't be able to properly use measurement, ad personalization, and remarketing features in Google Ads anymore. So we've created a little flow here to sort of highlight what this looks like in terms of where different brands could be. So the first question is asking, are you collecting data from these users? And if the answer is no, you may think you're in the clear, but it is important to consider that upcoming regulations, like the ones that are happening in Australia, will likely restrict audience creation and retargeting similar to what we currently see for EU and US rules, following very closely what the GDPR has. If you are collecting data, however, and you have implemented a cookie management platform, that's one step in the right direction. And so, again, if you haven't, however, what will happen is, as I mentioned before, Google will limit and suspend and can even suspend your use of the Google product and terminate your agreement, which is a breach of their policy as of earlier this year. And if you are using it, the next question to ask is, are you already using consent mode? If you are, then great. If you aren't, then again, the same consideration applies. And this is similar to sort of what happened with GA4 and implementation there. Again, it came out to address privacy regulation, but many organizations and brands delayed implementation. But again, what this did ultimately was put them at larger risk of consequences of not adhering to these policies and regulations. And then I guess the next question is, why does this matter? Why can't we just operate with less data? Well, while users are increasingly privacy conscious and informed, and the great majority believe that the risks outweigh the benefits, they also equally demand ad personalization. And this is what is termed as the privacy personalization paradox, which is a great challenge for marketers to address. Now, it doesn't just go one way where they want they want personalization, but because of privacy, that's the challenge. It does go both ways. So a recent smart tourism study, for example, found negative effects of privacy concerns in user-generated content creation were neutralized by the perceived benefits and sense of belonging. So it's our goal as marketers to find that middle ground that allows for personalized experiences while also adhering to privacy regulation. And one thing we can do is consider creating a value exchange, something we'll touch on later. But the key question takeaway is, how, as travel marketers, can we do that? Can we achieve this?
Great, thanks, Marco. So the next section is navigating the global data privacy landscape with a focus on Australia. So the question that we were asked was, how can travel marketers navigate the complex web of global data privacy regulation with a focus on complying with Australia's changing privacy requirements? So as you can imagine, this is quite a large topic. I'm going to cover it in as much detail as possible that I've got in the time for this section, which is around 15, 20 minutes. But if you do have questions, chuck them in the Q&A and I will get back to you on them. So as travel marketers, our work is arguably more complex than most because many of us do work internationally and we target customers internationally. So we've got the burden of complying with data privacy requirements here in Australia, but we've also got the burden of complying with global privacy regulations. So in this section, we're going to aim to answer two questions. What is happening globally? And then we're going to bring it back home to Australia, what's happening here. So the global data privacy landscape is changing quickly. This visual that you've got on the screen here is from DLA Piper. The URL is on the bottom left hand of the screen. I really recommend you go and take a look at this website. It's very good. It covers data protection laws by country, and you can really drill down and look at what the legal requirements are for each region. You look at things like compliance, enforcement, and you can even see countries side by side. Very useful tool. But the key message when you look at the site is that almost all countries are covered by some form of regulation. So of the 94 countries, 137 have some form of regulation in data privacy regulation in place. That's around 70%. And that actually covers around 65% of the global population. And that 65% of the global population does really correlate with consumers that have spending power to do things like travel. So again, it's really important that you take a look at this. So as you can see visually, just looking at this map, that most countries have moderate or strict protection laws. Most of the Western economies that many of us will work in are covered by heavy regulation. So you can see the red countries here. You've got the US, you've got Canada, Mexico, you've got Australia, you've got UK, and then you've got all of the other EU countries, Germany, Spain, France, Italy, etc. I won't list them all. Surprisingly, you can see there that China has heavy regulation, and I'll address that in a bit more detail in a moment, as does South Korea, and Japan is moderate. Interestingly, when you look at all of these, like I said, the DLA Piper data allows you to look at countries side by side. What you can actually see is that most of these countries, or many of these countries, I should say, have extraterritorial scope. So that means that the governments of those countries intend to enforce their laws with overseas companies. And obviously that's a significant risk for us as travel marketers if we're doing international campaigns. So how I would use this asset, I suggest the starting point is to look over the DLA Piper data protection map yourself and explore any territories that you might have campaigns in, or you might be collecting data from consumers in those territories. And then I would encourage you to speak to your DPO, your data protection officer, or compliance or legal team, just to discuss your compliance measures in each of those regions. So the global standard for data privacy is the GDPR, and I'm sure everyone has heard of the GDPR. Essentially, it sets out the international benchmark for data privacy, and it requires businesses to safeguard the personal data of EU citizens. And as I mentioned, it's not just for European companies. It applies globally, and it does apply to Australian businesses. So anyone that's doing work over borders really needs to comply with this. And the penalties are harsh for non-compliance, or I should say high rather than harsh. They're up to 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover. And I'll give you an overview of how that compares to non-compliance penalties here in Australia. It is worth noting that no Australian companies have been fined under GDPR yet. However, there have been several extraterritorial, i.e. non-EU fines for UK and US companies, and those are actually reaching travel companies as well. I've got a few examples of which travel companies have fallen foul of GDPR, which I'll take you through in a moment. So as mentioned, GDPR is the gold standard, and that is touted by people who are way more in the know than us. And the reason why it's the global standard is because it's the most comprehensive and far-reaching data protection regime globally. Privacy regulation in the EU has been enforced regularly and to the maximum extent, and it's being tested. So some of the definitions, scopes, principles have all been tested and starting to be enforced for a number of years. And the other thing I would say about the EU, I was going to do a section on this, but I didn't have time in today's session, is that they are moving fast on other aspects of data privacy. So, for example, the DSA, the Digital Services Act, that has recently been enacted, and that is going to affect the travel market. So platforms like Booking.com are classed as VLOPs in the EU. What is a VLOP, I hear you say? A VLOP is a very large online platform. So I think the criteria is something like maybe 45 million users. So it covers TikTok, Meta, all of those things, but very large websites or platforms are also falling into that. Uber, some of the other platforms that you'll all be familiar with. And the reason this is important is because compliance requirements are different to GDPR, and penalties for non-compliance are slightly different to GDPR as well. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I'm sure it's somewhere around 6% of turnover. So other countries that are modeling their data privacy regime on GDPR, so I mentioned this in the previous slide, Japan is interesting. They have something called the APPI, and that was a major update in 2017, and it's undergone another update in 2022. There is close alignment with GDPR, but also, surprisingly, the Australian privacy principles, the apps. There was big focus on breach notifications in the update and also cross-border transfer. That's something that you're going to hear a lot as I work my way through this. Cross-border transfer is a really hot topic within all of these privacy updates. Next is China, the PIPL. That was introduced in 2021, and it's heavy restriction on data privacy. It's currently being refined further as well. So there is a significant focus on data sovereignty and cross-border transfers, as well as compliance and auditing that's coming through in the next update. And there is a strict data privacy regime that looks like it's going to be enacted. So for travel businesses here in Australia, I think this is a really hot topic. Data privacy for Australian travel brands doing business in China. So if there is enough demand for that topic, I'm happy to organize another one of these sessions where we specifically drill down on the PIPL and what that means for travel businesses. You let us know, and if there's demand, we'll organize it. The third and final example of another country modeling privacy on the GDPR is Brazil. They had the LGPD, and it was widely discussed that how closely it aligned with GDPR when they launched it in 2020. Initially, there was a very strong focus on cross-border transfer of data, and that's since been wound back a bit. So I think it was last year, 2023, that they relaxed that a little. I'm guessing because it was making business not as feasible as it was before. So GDPR principles, compliance is actually very simple. There are 7 core tenets of the privacy principles. Lawful, fairness, and transparency being the first. So processing personal data should be lawful, fair, and transparent, and it should respect the individual. Ben's going to talk a bit more later on about privacy by design, and you're going to hear a bit of repetition when he goes over that. So he'll stay sharp on that point. The next is purpose limitations. So that's about collecting data for specific, explicit, and legitimate purposes. Next is data minimization. That is only collecting and processing the data that's required for the purpose that you've stated. Accuracy, next one. So just keeping your data up to date at all times. Storage limitation. So store the data only for as long as required for the purpose, again, that you've communicated. Then where am I? I'm on integrity and confidentiality. Keep the data safe, away from unlawful processing and away from accidental loss. And the final one in their principles is accountability. So the data controller must be able to demonstrate full compliance with GDPR. Being marketers, we like to simplify things. So in our view, modern data privacy is all about consent. So the framework that I encourage marketers to use it's a simple one. It's consent and accountability. Consent being about the consumer and accountability being about you and your organization. So I'll deconstruct this very quickly. Consent, what does the consumer expect by lending you their data? And I think that term lend is poignant, and you should really think about data in that context. It doesn't belong to you, it belongs to someone else, and you've borrowed it to use it, and they have the power to take it away at any point, as well as tell you what to do with it. So there are a handful of simple questions you can ask yourself that are a basic compliance test. They are: does the consumer know what data I have? Does the consumer know what I'm doing with the data? Can the consumer access that data if required? And can the consumer opt out of use? So it's best practice to gain and document explicit consent. And if you've just answered probably, maybe, or I don't know, then I would suggest that that's not good enough in 2024. And you may get yourself into hot water, particularly if you're marketing in one of those red hot markets that I showed earlier on. The next section of making this easy, consent and accountability model, is accountability. So we've just acknowledged it's not your data. So what are you doing to protect the data on behalf of the consumer that you're borrowing it from? Again, there are a handful of questions you can ask yourself here. So the first is, do I have explicit and documented consent for the collection and use of the personal data? That's basically the covering off the first item of consent. The next is, the next you can ask yourself is, am I storing the data securely? The next you can ask yourself is, am I storing only the data I need? Next is, am I storing the data only for the period that it's needed? That can be a tricky one to answer. So it needs some thought. And then the final one is, am I using the data only for the agreed purpose? That goes back to the consent piece. So again, it's best practice to document your efforts to be accountable for what you're doing with the data. And again, if you just answered probably, maybe, or don't know, that's not good enough in 2024. And you will get yourself into hot water at some point. So you need to speak to your compliance officer, DPO, or someone in the know. So the cost of non-compliance, I wanted to focus in on travel here and demonstrate some extraterritorial scope by the EU to show that they had fined outside of the EU. And just a reminder for those of you who can see the pound signs there. Obviously, the UK is not EU anymore. So that's one of the areas that I'm going to focus in on in a moment. So the brands that have been fined are Marriott, Clearview, British Airways, Amazon France Logistics. A small Finnish travel agency group has been fined, and Ryanair has been fined as well. So I'm only going to cover one of these in the interest of time, and that is British Airways. So British Airways was fined 20 million by the UK Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, in 2020. And the reason that's interesting is because that fine actually started out as 183 million, and it was wound back to 20 million. But it was a pretty big breach in 2018. they had a breach which affected around 400,000 customers globally, so a huge breach. And I think this is a good point just to draw a bit of comparison between the EU fines and the fines in Australia. So if we take that example of 2020, 400,000 customers obviously being a big one. In Australia, we had the Optus data breach in 2020, and that was one of the country's largest data breaches. Obviously, we don't have 400, sorry, we do have 400,000. This affected 10 million customers here in Australia, which was 40% of our population. And the maximum fine that was allowed at the time was 2.2 million, which obviously, when you look at this, it doesn't really cut it. And Optus then went on a year later to receive another fine, where I think that was 1.5 million from the ACMA. And there really is a question there about whether they would have been fined a second time, whether that breach would have happened a second time if the fines were as large as they were in the EU. So to finish this section off on GDPR, if you are targeting EU customers, we recommend you take action to ensure compliance. Speak to your internal counsel, whoever's looking after data compliance, legal, all of that kind of stuff. They're normally clued up on this subject. If not, you can speak to us. We can point you in the right direction, or you can perform a self-assessment online using the GDPR.eu tool. So the next question you asked us was, how is Australia's evolving data privacy landscape shaping the future of travel marketing, and what steps can companies take to navigate these changes successfully? So I'll get to the action points at the end. First of all, I'm going to take you through what's happening here in Australia. So the Australian Privacy Act, hopefully it's not a surprise to anyone that that act is in place. It's been in place since 1988. And it applies to businesses and government agencies with a turnover exceeding 3 million. There have been dramatic increases in penalties since the examples that I just gave you in 2022, which really underscore the importance of compliance. There are 13 guiding principles called APPs under the Australian Privacy Act. And they can broadly be split into 6 categories that you can see on the screen here. So consent, collection, use and disclosure, data quality, access and correction, data destruction. These actually quite closely align with the GDPR. The things that tend to differ is definitions, the scope of what's included, and the obligations. So enforcement and penalties. What is the cost of non-compliance today? So historically, I mentioned 2.22 million was the maximum fine. That was deemed insufficient on the back of the Optus and Medibank data breaches, and it needed to change. So that needed to happen ahead of the reform that we're going through now, which is being introduced in 2024. So the penalties today, and I'll take you through each of these quickly and then refer back to some of the variables in there. So it's up to $50 million Aussie, or 3 times any benefit gained from the data breach, or 30% of adjusted turnover during the period of the breach, and it's whichever is greater. So if I go back to the 3 times any benefit gained from the breach, the 50 million isn't the maximum. So let's say you've done a breach and it's gained you 25 million, for example. Well, you can 3 times that to 75 million. So your fine is up straight away there from the 50 million set. The second example I gave was the 30% of turnover for the period of the breach. So let's say you have had a bad breach going for 3 years, and your company is turning over 100 million. Potentially, you've got a fine of $90 million there for non-compliance. So as you can see, they're significant and they're business enders. If you get caught, particularly on the last 2 examples there, your business is going to be in serious trouble. And there are penalties for individual sole traders and partnerships as well. That used to be around 440, and it's up to 2.5 million for serious and repeated breaches. So the takeaway is it's serious and it's here and now. So you really must do everything you can to comply. So here are the Australian privacy principles. There's 13 of them. I am not going to go through each one of these with you. I think I'd lose some attendees if I did. These have been in place since 2014 when the national privacy principles and the information privacy principles merged. So we've had 10 years. Your organization should be up to speed on these. And what I would say about them is that I think the apps are likely to remain in place following the reform. That's just my opinion, not fact at this point, because they're a sound foundation for privacy in 2024. The thing that will change will be the definitions, the scopes, and the obligations that fall within them. So again, if you're not sure about how your company is in line with apps, then speak to someone internally or then come speak to an expert. In terms of how we're doing for the changes, so the Australian Privacy Review, what's changing in 2024, I'm not going to go too into detail here because we're pushing it on time, but I'll give you their headline. There's expanded personal information there's been an expansion of definition of personal information. So things like IP, device identifiers, location data, and other identifiers are included. And that list isn't exhausted, and it's not necessarily data that can be used to identify someone. So the scope is quite broad. There is a new fair and reasonable test for handling data. So even if you've got consent, you still need to say, is this fair and reasonable use of the data? So for example, if you're a travel insurance app and you are selling insurance for European trips, it may be fair and reasonable to collect location data through your mobile app to support the delivery of your services. However, if you use the same app then to access health information from an iPhone, for example, that is likely to fall outside the category of what's fair and reasonable. So just a tangible example for you there. Then other things that are changing are restrictions and changes to definitions like direct marketing, targeting, and trading. Personal information, they're all very broad and they're ambiguous, and they're causing alarm bells in the marketing industry. Privacy breach penalties, I've already covered those, they're going up. And the final one is enhanced regulatory powers for the Office of Australian Information Commissioner. So the industry has responded to this. The IAB and ADMA have been leading the way on the response. Very high view on this topic is that both ADMA, IAB in Australia, and many other private businesses actually support the modernization of the Privacy Act. There are some concerns over clarity and definitions. I've already talked about those things like targeting, trading. They're too broad, they go too far, and they actually affect things like audience segmenting and standard business practice that we all use as digital marketers. The next is concerns out of opt-out clauses and data use. The industry generally doesn't support an unqualified right for the consumer to opt out of targeted advertising. Then there is the topic of ensuring global competitiveness. There is a fear that it's not fully aligned with global standards, and that could put Australia at a disadvantage when they're trying to comply because of the cost of it. So the takeaway from this slide is that industry bodies and some private companies are working with the government to strike the right balance between consumer protection and business viability. But this is coming into play in 2024. So what actions can you take? So there are 6 actions we're recommending. Remember to go back to the consent and accountability model. Ensure you have full consent, ensure you that you're accountable for the data. But the 6 steps you can take are undertake a full and comprehensive data order. So know what you're collecting, storing, and using, and identify any gaps in compliance. The next is using privacy policies, updating them, ensuring they meet the requirements of the APA and GDPR. The third is enhance your consent mechanisms, so promote clarity, transparency, and ensure consent is explicit and documented. You're going to need technology for that normally. We'll talk about that later. Implement data protection measures, so treat data like it's one of your family members' data. So if your mum, dad gave you their data, one of your children, make sure you treat it like it's your family's data, and strengthen security. Train your staff. Many issues are human error, so ensure all of your team understand the basics of Australian and global privacy data requirements. And then the final one is monitor and report. So put in place effective monitoring and reporting. This is something we do a lot of. Your senior executive team and board members should be asking you for this. So if not, flag it with them. Show them that you're being proactive, and use this presentation as the fuel for that conversation. So that was that section. I'm going to move on to measuring marketing performance in a world of disappearing data. The question that you asked was, data sources are becoming increasingly restricted due to privacy regulations. How can travel marketers adapt their measurement strategies to continue tracking and optimizing marketing performance effectively? And I am going to go to Ben to answer that question.
Thank you. This is something we already covered during the introduction, but just wanted to rephrase. Our ability to gather data is becoming more and more constrained due to ad blockers, due to cookies, due to privacy regulation, app tracking, shorter conversion window. And as marketer, we're going to see less and less data. So how are we going to take decisions based on what we are collecting? So I wanted to start with a timeline that I wanted to show you over the last few years. So if you can just go on the next slide, please, Andre. So this is the summary of what happens in the last 13 years. But I really want to start with 2011, because I think that's one of the main milestones when GDPR introduced the right to refuse the use of cookies. 2016 was when GDPR passed, and 2018 was when it came into full effect. But GDPR was really the precursor of all the other regulations. So CCPA came in 2020, the CDP in 2024, and then we have also this update of the Australian Privacy Act in 2024. So it's really just like the backbone of all the regulations, but all those regulations had a massive impact on browsers and also platforms. So I'm going to start with the browsers. Everything started with Safari and Mozilla that's responded to those regulations by restricting the use of third-party cookies, and then ultimately remove all the third-party cookies. Google is still a bit late in the game. They made the announcement in 2020, but since then they've just been postponing till this year. Officially, it's going to be by the end of the year. But yeah, we're still waiting for that. But the impact on browsers are already been seen. And then the last point is the platform. So we can see Facebook and Google Ads already changed the way they were collecting data. Back into 2018 and 2020, they changed towards using more first-party data. And then one of the big change, and especially for me as an analyst, was Universal Analytics. The only reason why Universal Analytics was sunset was because of privacy issue and not being able to collect data while respecting those new regulations, which is why GA4 came into place. Now, as marketers, what are the impacts that we're going to have in terms of the data we're going to be seeing? Well, apart from not having all the data, obviously, we're going to also have limited audiences. So the audience that we're going to have in platform, in Meta and Google Ads, are going to be reduced because we can't rely anymore on the third-party cookies. We have this also perceived decrease in campaign effectiveness, or ROI, because we will track less and less conversions. And our conversion windows are also going to be very much shorter, So it's going to be harder for us to really understand how well the campaigns are performing. Challenging in personalization too, because we used to rely a lot on cookies. In terms of the attribution, we also have to rethink everything, especially in the travel industry. You have very long user journey, which means multiple touch points. But at the moment, because of the shorter conversion window and the deletion of cookies that are automatically done by browsers, we just need to rethink of how we're going to do attribution. If you are a publisher and you have ads on your websites, you will see also some of the revenue generated by those as being reduced by ad blockers and things like this. So we really need to think of evaluating also the compliance risk that we have, but also starting thinking of alternative methods. Can you go to the next slide? This is more for practitioners, just for you to understand the impact on the direct metrics or KPIs we might use on a day-to-day, based on the user choice. So if I want or not use the cookies, and based on the device and browsers that I'm using, you're going to be able to collect data or not. But ultimately, we will start seeing impressions going down, click-through rate going down, conversion going down, everything. By the way, everything looks like really gloom and doom at the moment, but I swear there are like features and solutions. But that's discussions that we will have to get and have within the teams, because we see less data, and ultimately we will see decrease in performance across all our campaigns. So what we can do about it? There are ways of adapting to these new worlds, these new cookie worlds. And the first one is going to be maximize the first-party data. There is a lot we can do, and I'm going to cover some of the strategies you can implement, some of the new technologies, or even features for the platform we are currently using. But the idea is make the best use of the data we already have. Explore alternative tracking. So you have discussions around like the server-side tracking. So for instance, one of the Facebook feature, which is the conversion API, is server-side. We also have to think shifting to contextual targeting. So how do we serve ads based on the website where the user is rather than the user itself? We also have to rethink the attribution models, and there are tools for that. But we will always have to rethink everything starting with the privacy at the center. So design privacy by design, and making sure that the way we use the tools are always respecting and in compliance of those regulations. And one of the hardest thing I find at the moment is to stay informed about what's happening, which is also why we are doing that webinar today. It changes every day, and it changes fast. Like the example that Marco was giving on the consent mode V2, they made the announcement and we had a few weeks to adapt. So it's going to be up to every marketer to always stay alert to what's happening and just adapt based on that. So can you go on the next slide, please? Some of the solutions, and I'm not going to cover all of them today. This is for next time. But that's some of the features that already are in place and that have been created by the different ad platforms. So I'm just going to focus on some of them and just give you examples. So Google, for instance, have created what they call the consent mode, right? So the ability of collecting data based on the user consent that will unlock the behavioral modeling or the conversion modeling in Google Ads. You have this new way of implementing conversion tags for Google Ads, which is called the enhanced conversion. You have Meta, I just touched on that, which is the conversion API. But you also have new features like, so the top left one is the Google Privacy Sandbox, where you have new APIs, new way of collecting data about the users while respecting those regulations. And then the other one that I put is StackAdapt. It's one of the tools that we're using and in Marketing We Trust. But I think it's interesting because they're using page context AI. So based off the content within the page, we're going to serve different ads, different formats based on what the user is consuming. We'll be able to serve the right ads. And then there is this new way of identifying user, which is the derived user identity graph, which is not only relying on cookies, but on different parameters that we can collect. So there is a lot happening, and this is what's going to happen on the 10th of April. So Selena and I were gonna talk about the cookie deprecation, how we implement the cookie consent banner, and how we unlock the consent modes, and what are the impact on the different tools and things. So I invite everyone to join us on the next one.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. You can sign up on our website for that, by the way, and you'll probably get an email if you've attended this. So the final section is empowering performance and privacy through technology. So the question that you asked us was, balancing innovation, performance, and compliance is challenging. How can travel marketers harness the power of technology to protect consumer privacy and drive marketing performance? Over to you.
Thank you again, Paul. So firstly, it's considering MarTech in its entirety, the stack that we have, and making sure it's privacy first. So things to consider in this is, how can we employ technology in establishing more meaningful customer relationships? How can we minimize the risk of privacy infringement? And how can we construct a best practice privacy enhancing MarTech stack?
And
so first,
oh, sorry, you go ahead.
No worries. So I was saying the first area we're going to cover is using tech to build more meaningful customer relationships. Next slide, please. So firstly, we've talked about a few things around a value exchange, and it's not all doom and gloom. There are still ways of being able to get a competitive edge, or getting data or value from users, or delivering it, while also maintaining privacy rights. And this comes in the balance of understanding what the consumer rights are versus the competitive opportunity there. And so through meeting the needs and adhering to privacy standards and maintaining we can maintain a position of trust. And by embracing these opportunities, what we need to do to drive a competitive differentiation. So there's a few examples here. I won't go through all of them. I'll just touch on one or two. But for example, looking at the right of erasure and competitive trust. So consumers have the right to erase their data, allowing them to request deletion of it. And we can leverage this to bolster consumer trust and position our brand as a leader in privacy and customer respect, building that brand sentiment and positive reputation. And similarly, we also have the right to data portability and personalization. So consumers are entitled to data portability, and that means that they can obtain and reuse their personal data across different services. So what does this mean for us? It means we can enable real-time personalization, offering travel services that dynamically adapt to their current needs, and also enhancing their satisfaction and loyalty to the brand. But ultimately, we won't ever have the same amount of data, but if we offer value, trust, and transparency, we can mutually benefit both as marketers and as consumers in a privacy world. And better privacy is better for customers, and it's important to be champions of both of those things. So we can address clients' increasing desire for meaningful, personalized experiences that are one-to-one. And we can also have a better offering through value exchanges where consumers feel benefits from sharing their data and encourage consented data sharing. We can also leverage emerging technologies from the wake of privacy and as it's currently unfolding to enhance our offerings further. And this comes, a great example is AI. Over to you, Ben.
So I'm just going to cover a few examples of technologies that we could use. So one is going to be the customer data platform, as in CDP, reverse ETL, and then the data clean room. So first one is going to be the customer data platform and what it is. So the CDP is a software tool that gather and organize the data about your customers from different sources. So it creates a single and comprehensive profile of each of the user, which will help you understand your customer better and then tailor the different marketing efforts that you want based on their preferences. So in short, help you improve the customer experience while driving more effective marketing campaigns by having all that data in a centralized piece. Now, there are lots of different CDPs that exist in the world. You have Salesforce that has one, you have Segment, Tilium, Adobe, and choosing a CDP is not an easy thing. And I really invite and recommend everyone to start by defining the use cases that you want to cover. What are the things from a business perspective that you want your CDP to help you with? And then based on that and with a partner, you will be able to decide which CDP is the best for you. The next technology is what we call the reverse ETL. So ETL stands for extract, transform, load. So the major difference here is that you already have sort of a data warehouse where your data is, and the reverse ETL is going to be you extracting just a piece of information that you want to share with the ad platforms. So the idea is you only take the data that is required, you minimize it, you anonymize it, and then you pass it to the platform so you can have better audiences or better understanding on how your marketing platform is. So when it comes to picking between CDP and ETL, there is no typical answer to that. It really depends on, once again, the use case that you have, and depending also on how much you want to if you already have a data set with all your customer data, or if you don't, and then based on that, you will be able to take one or the other. But one doesn't necessarily replace the other neither. The last one is what we call the data clean room, as we prefer internally to call them data collaboration platform. So I invite everyone, there is a link here to the IAB article that explains a bit more in detail. But here it's sort of you share in one place information about your customers, and you will have access also to platforms, data, or publisher or ad network data. So the difference with the CDP or the ETL is, once again, you are giving the data and put it into the data clean room. So you have a lot of all the big players in there. So Google, Adobe, Microsoft, all Facebook will have data clean room. The difference is that you're going to give your data back into there, so then you can use it for different marketing purposes. So now the next one is how do we minimize the risk while maximizing the reward? So once again, not everything is gloom and doom. It's just we need to change the way we are tackling data and how we are processing it. So there are a few strategies that we need to put in place to have the proper privacy protection. One is data minimization, the vendor risk assessment, data protection officer, the privacy by design. Those four, I'm going to go into the detail, and then you have trainings and ethical data usage. But let's start with the data minimization. That's something we touched on a bit earlier. But really here, the principle is that you're going to collect data for a stated usage and only for a limited amount of time. So you have to tell the users what you're going to collect, how long you're going to take it, for what it is, and only use that data for that purposes. One of the perks of having that sort of data minimization is that you're going to limit you're going to reduce the cost. You have less data to store, so you're going to reduce the cost. It's going to be easier to manage, to access the data, and it's also going to improve the customer trust. Because we had, let's say in the past, marketers, we had a very bad tendency of tracking and collecting every piece of information that we could about our users. We need to go back to less is more, collect what you need for a particular usage and for a particular reason, and letting the user know what it is for. The second thing that I wanted to showcase is the vendor risk assessment. So I just presented the CDP or data clean room or even reverse ETL. You will have a lot of vendors, and you will have in the near future more and more vendors. So the idea with that is you start comparing the different vendors for the use case that you have, and ranking them based on different factors that can be the security practices, the privacy policies, support availability, and then it's going to help you selecting the right vendor for the particular need that you have. This one I think is really important too, is to designate someone as the data protection officer. It's a very important role. And the idea is this person is going to be responsible for ensuring the compliance with the data protection law, so GDPR or Australian Privacy Act. And it englobes things like awareness, education, training, or recommendations. This is the person to go when there is anything to ask about privacy, is owning it, and you can ask for help, and is also having all those reports around the compliance and the governance and everything. So this is one of the first things I recommend everyone to have, is designate one data protection officer to help you going through the different changes that will be required by privacy changes. Last one is, I really like this one, is privacy by design. This is it's an old framework. Actually, it was created in the 1990s by someone called Anne Cavoukian. And the idea is to put the privacy in the center. So privacy should be the key part of designing any product or systems from the start. So there are 7 main ideas, like protecting the privacy from the beginning, making the privacy in the default setting, or having the security all the way through. This makes sure that privacy is built in the process from the start, rather than just added at the end. So you may recognize some of those earlier in the talk. So Paul was showing us like the GDPR or even the Australian Privacy Act, and we can recognize some of that. Is because those regulations have been like put the privacy by design in the center of everything. So it's something that I'm doing, and especially when I do data collection and basic tracking, even for GFO, is always rethinking everything around the privacy and putting in the center from the start.
And then finally, what we have here is, what does a best practice MarTech stack look like? That's privacy centric at the center of it. So if we jump to the next slide. So at a high level, we can break this down into sort of 5 different sections, the backbone being the thing that underpins everything. So this is the secure and compliant data infrastructure that supports everything else. It's the foundation for all our marketing activities, and it prioritizes data privacy and security. The next 4 sections, we have discovery, decide, automate, and activate. So these all correspond to various elements of the MarTech stack, but essentially discovery is implementing tools and processes for analyzing data and deriving insights from aggregated and anonymized user data sets. Delivery, so that's privacy compliant communication. So it's ensuring that all our marketing comms adhere to privacy regulation, they're consent-based, and use privacy aware channels. Activation is really about leveraging zero-party and first-party data to personalize experiences without compromising privacy. And automation is utilizing AI and machine learning that are appearing more and more on the platforms to make up for that gap in the data that we can collect, but of course, in an ethical manner. And also, we want to automate tasks for efficiency, because every marketer is very busy at the end of the day. And we also want to ensure transparency, and it doesn't impact control for consumers. And then once we put that into practice, what it can look like is this huge slide of lots of different elements. But very simply, there are 4 key pillars here. So there's unification, processing and storage, activation, as well as marketing measurement. So unification is our inputs and data collection. Processing and storage is how we securely hold as well as augment our data. Activation is our outputs or delivery to consumers. And with marketing measurement, that underpins everything and informs everything. While these are the 4 key aspects of it, there are other elements there and sections there that you can see. Some of them to call out that we've already talked about is CDPs, or customer data platforms. To Ben's point, there's centralized command centers that we aggregate our data from various sources, and including our existing customers. We also have content hubs, which are libraries that comprise what our messaging is. And we also have MarTech orchestration, which to its name is like a conductor that coordinates everything to create a cohesive and unified marketing strategy. And again, it's very important to put emphasis on some of the principles that Ben mentioned previously, which is things like data minimalization, anonymization, encryption, and transparency to ensure that user privacy is prioritized throughout the process end to end.
Great, thank you both. So we're going to wrap things up now just with a quick summary. I'm going to ask everyone to highlight 2 or 3 things from the sections that they covered, the things that they want the audience to take away today. I'm going to start with you, Marco, for setting the scene right at the start.
So 3 takeaways. Things are rapidly evolving in the privacy world. There's big benefits to proactively addressing it for businesses, but there's also big consequences that come from ignoring it.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, there's going to be some repetition here, but the key one is data privacy is going to continue to evolve in favor of the consumer. And as I've said multiple times today, compliance is just not a choice. You will get into hot water if you ignore it. The next is, as a global industry, it makes sense to comply to the highest global standard while paying particular attention to the nuance of local regulations. So if we put that into practice here in Australia, yes, we need to look at Australian law, but let's look also at the gold standard of GDPR. And then the third is, as marketers, I mentioned, we are not legal people. We need to use simple but effective models that are easy to understand. So consent and accountability for me is a really easy model to understand. So most people can grasp that relatively easy. So that's a good one to use. Ben.
Yeah, on the measurements, well, the measurements are being limited to all the changes that happen at the moment. The second point is going to be the cookie consent management is a good starting point. Just purchase a cookie management platform and just ask for user consent before you collect the data. And then a lot is changing and fast. And I feel like Australia is a bit late when compared to the rest of the world, but we will need to catch up very fast. And then in terms of the privacy and privacy enhancing technology, I think starting by designate a data protection officer to help everyone navigate all those changes is the first step. Then start exploring tools like technologies like CDP, reverse ETL, or data clean room, and unlock new capabilities within the team using one of those. And then in terms of strategy, I feel like the apply privacy by design on everything that you do is going to be also a key element.
Yeah, I'd agree. Privacy by design, it's a really strong framework to use. So recommend that one as well. So next is the Q&A. I have got a few questions here. I've got 2 to start with, and we'll see who's going to answer those. So the first question is, I assume this is about the Australian Privacy Act. When does it kick in? So the date of that is 2024. So there is a commitment from the government to implement. There are no firm dates yet, and there has been back and forth on the review. So some of those points that I mentioned earlier on around the lack of clarity on definitions, particularly the ones that have consequence around segmentation, targeting, trading, all of those require some further clarification. So the only date I can give you is sometime in 2024 is the answer. Then I've got one more question. Who's this one for? I would say this is probably for Ben. It is, do you need cookie consent in Australia?
Yes. Very short answer.
Do you want to give him more
No,
on that?
Now, so as I was just mentioning before, we need to prepare for what's happening. So at the moment, looking at the Privacy Act in Australia, just having the banner explaining that you are using cookie is good enough. But it's going to change very fast because we're going to have to implement and ask the cookie consent for the user. We will need also to keep track of that consent, which means that we need to use a cookie management platform solution. And all the changes that you could do now in Australia, even if then you apply a different fallback for all users, but at least when you will have to turn on that technology, you can just turn it on. So consent mode is going to be one of the things I recommend everyone to do as soon as possible.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Ben. I've got two more here, and that's all we're going to have time for, I'm afraid, because we are running a bit over. So for those who have stuck around to the end, really appreciate your time. We've got two good questions here. The first one is IP really classed as personal data? Who wants to take that one?
Yes. Don't store IPs. No, so once again, it depends on where you store it, right? So from a Google Analytics perspective, IP is a big no-no. It's against the policies. Now, depends on the usage you want to do and why you are storing the IPs. So once again, go back to the data minimization. Why do I even want to store IPs in the first place? And just do that journey of do I think it's worth having it, how long I'm going to store it, and what I'm going to do with it.
Perfect.
And I think you will get your answer of I shouldn't be storing IPs. That's the output.
Yeah, I mean, that question really has caused a lot of debate over the years. I think when it was first introduced, many people were really surprised that IP was actually being classed as personally identifiable information, or PI, as we call it here in Australia. So yeah, good question. The next question, I'm not going to read your name out because you might get in trouble for this one. And it is that they have got email addresses within their analytics account. What is the consequences and what can they do about it?
I'm going to go back to me again. So this is against GFR policies. So it's forbidden to have any PII being stored. There is one feature which is called data deletion request. So you could ask Google Analytics to delete some of the events that have that data breach. But ultimately, it's going to depend on the volume of data that you have stored already. Because if we are talking hundreds or thousands, usually what we recommend to our clients is to start from scratch and have a new GA4 property that is run in parallel. Because according to Google, you are against their policy, so they could delete your accounts at any stage if they wanted to.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think again, that's another one that surprises some of our clients that we deal with, that that's treated so seriously by Google. And you use the word breach there. Obviously, you're moving it from yourself to a platform that is secure, so people necessarily don't think that that's a bad thing. But yeah, I can confirm it's treated very seriously by Google. Great. Well, that is all we have time for today. Like I said, we have run over, and I do appreciate everyone sticking around. Your time is valuable, and we appreciate you giving us your time and your attention. I'd just like to thank Marco and Ben for their efforts on the presentation today. Obviously, it takes a bit of time getting this material together for you, so thank you both for that. And also, the man behind the scenes, Andre, thank you very much for being our host and controlling things behind the scenes. As mentioned at the start, my name is Paul Hewett. If you've got any questions relating to anything that we've covered here today, please reach out to me direct, and I'll happily answer any of your questions. But in the meantime, I hope you all have a lovely evening or lovely day if you're not in Australia. And I hope you join us for the next webinars that are on the 10th of April, cookie deprecation, and on the 24th of April, which is about generative AI, both at this time. So thank you all very much, and have a nice rest of your day.